The rain hammered against the windows of the estate like thousands of tiny fists demanding entry. Stood in the kitchen, her dark hands trembling as she gripped the edge of the marble counter. The expensive Italian tiles beneath her feet felt cold, even through her worn shoes. She had been working for the family for nearly 15 years, ever since she had arrived in Connecticut from Georgia, searching for a better life. Now, at 53 years old, she wondered if that search had led her to this moment of absolute terror and impossible hope. The house was empty except for her. Mrs. Elizabeth had gone to her weekly charity luncheon, the kind where wealthy women gathered to discuss helping the poor while sipping champagne that cost more than its monthly salary. Mr. Richard was at his law firm downtown, defending corporations against accusations of wrongdoing. Their daughter was away at college, studying literature and probably not thinking much about the maid who had raised her through countless scraped knees and heartbreaks. But it was their son, Thomas, who occupied every corner of her mind at this moment. Thomas, who had been declared dead 3 years ago. Thomas, whose funeral she had attended, watching Mrs. collapse against her husband's shoulder while stood in the back, her own grief private and unacknowledged. Thomas, who she had loved like her own child, having never been blessed with children of her own. The thing was, knew something no one else knew. She knew Thomas was alive, or at least she believed it with every fiber of her being, and that knowledge was tearing her apart. It had started 2 weeks ago on a Tuesday evening. Had been taking her usual route home, walking through the older part of town where grand houses from the previous century stood in various states of decay. The neighborhood had once been prestigious, but time and economic shifts had transformed it into a ghost of its former glory. Most of the houses were abandoned, their windows dark and lifeless, their gardens overgrown with weeds that choked out any memory of former beauty. One house in particular had always caught attention. It was a massive Victorian structure, painted a faded gray, with a tower on one corner and a wraparound porch that sagged in the middle. The locals called it the house, named after the family that had built it in 1887. They had been textile magnates, their fortune built on mills that once employed half the town. But the last had died in the 1970s, and the house had stood empty ever since, too expensive to maintain and too old-fashioned for modern buyers. That Tuesday, as walked past the house, she had seen something that made her heart stop. A light, just a flicker in one of the upper windows, there and then gone like a candle being quickly extinguished. She had paused on the sidewalk, her grocery bags cutting into her palms, staring up at the dark window. The neighborhood was known for homeless people occasionally breaking into abandoned buildings for shelter, so seeing a light wasn't entirely unusual. But something about it had made her skin prickle with an undefined awareness. She had continued walking home, but the image of that light stayed with her. That night, she dreamed of Thomas. In the dream, he was young again, maybe 7 or 8 years old, running through the mansion playing hide and seek. She could hear his laughter echoing through the halls, that pure joyful sound that children make before the world teaches them to be careful with their happiness. In the dream, she searched for him, opening door after door, but he was always one room ahead, always just out of reach. She woke up with tears on her cheeks and an ache in her chest that felt like physical pain. The next day, she walked past the house again, this time deliberately, her eyes scanning every window. Nothing. The house looked as dead and empty as always. She felt foolish, an old woman chasing shadows and dreams. But the day after that, she saw it again. The same window, the same brief flicker of light. This time, she was certain she also saw movement, a shadow passing behind the grimy glass. Knew she should call the police. A squatter in an abandoned house was a matter for authorities, not for a middle-aged housekeeper. But something held her back, some instinct she couldn't name. Instead, she found herself walking closer to the house, pushing open the rusted iron gate that hung crooked on its hinges. The front path was cracked and broken, with grass growing through the gaps. The porch steps creaked alarmingly under her weight. She didn't go inside that day. She stood on the porch, her hand raised to knock on a door that probably hadn't been opened in decades, and suddenly the absurdity of the situation crashed over her. What was she doing? What did she expect to find? She turned and hurried away, embarrassed by her own foolishness. But the dreams continued. Every night Thomas appeared in them. Sometimes he was a child, sometimes the young man he had been when he died, or when they thought he had died. He never spoke in the dreams, but he was always trying to show her something, always gesturing for her to follow him. A week after seeing the first light, made a decision. She would go inside the house. She would prove to herself that there was nothing there but rats and decay, and then maybe the dreams would stop, and she could go back to her quiet, ordered life of cooking meals for people who barely noticed her and cleaning rooms in a house that had never truly been her home. She chose a Saturday afternoon when she had the day off. She dressed in her oldest clothes and brought a flashlight, though she told herself she was being ridiculous. The gate seemed even more reluctant to open this time, as if the house itself was warning her away. The porch steps groaned under her feet like living things in pain. The front door was locked, but one of the ground floor windows had a broken latch. Who had never broken into anything in her life, found herself sliding the window up and climbing through with a grace that surprised her. She landed in what had once been a formal parlor. Dust covered everything like a gray blanket. The furniture was still there, shrouded in white sheets that had yellowed with age. A grand piano stood in one corner, its keys probably warped beyond repair. The wallpaper, which had once been an elegant pattern of vines and flowers, was peeling away from the walls in long strips. The house smelled of mold and time and secrets. Its flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating particles of dust that danced in the air like tiny ghosts. Every step she took seemed to echo through the empty rooms, announcing her presence to whoever or whatever might be listening. She searched the ground floor first, moving from room to room. The dining room with its long table still set with china so covered in dust it was impossible to tell its original color. The kitchen with its ancient stove and a sink full of leaves that had blown in through a broken window. The library where books still lined the shelves, their spines faded and illegible. In one corner of the library, she found evidence that someone had indeed been using the house. A makeshift bed of old blankets, some empty food cans, a few plastic water bottles. But it was clearly old, abandoned months or even years ago. The stairs to the second floor curved upward in an elegant sweep, but many of the steps were rotted through. Tested each one carefully before putting her full weight on it. Twice, she felt would crack beneath her foot and had to quickly shift her weight. Her heart was pounding by the time she reached the upper landing, and she wasn't sure if it was from exertion or fear or something else entirely. The second floor was darker than the first. The windows here were smaller and most were covered with boards from the outside. Her flashlight seemed weaker here, its beam barely penetrating the shadows. She counted 6 bedrooms, each one frozen in time, still containing the possessions of the family. In one room, children's toys were scattered on the floor, a rocking horse standing sentinel in the corner, its paint peeling and one eye missing. In another, a woman's dressing table still held bottles of perfume, their contents long since evaporated. It was in the 4th bedroom that found the first sign that someone was currently living in the house. The bed here had been made, the old sheets pulled tight in a way that spoke of military precision or deep-seated discipline. On the nightstand was a glass of water, fresh enough that condensation still clung to its sides. And on the wall, illuminated by her flashlight beam, were newspaper clippings. Dozens of them, all tacked up in neat rows. Moved closer, her breath catching in her throat. The clippings were all about Thomas, his disappearance 3 years ago, the search efforts, the discovery of his car abandoned near a bridge, the memorial service, the articles about his parents' grief. There were also photographs printed from the internet showing Thomas at various ages. Thomas as a child, gap-toothed and grinning. Thomas as a teenager, serious and already showing the handsome features he would grow into. Thomas as a young man, just graduated from college, standing between his proud parents. His hands were shaking so badly she nearly dropped the flashlight. This couldn't be coincidence. This couldn't be some homeless person's strange obsession. This had to mean something. This had to mean Thomas was here. She turned slowly, sweeping the flashlight around the room, and that's when she saw the photographs on the dresser. Recent photographs printed on regular printer paper. They showed the house. Mrs. getting into her car, Mr. leaving for work. And there in the last photograph was herself, walking down the street with her grocery bags. Someone was watching the family. Someone was keeping track of them. And that someone had been here in this room recently enough that the water glass was still cold. His mind was racing. She should leave. She should call the police. This was stalking. This was dangerous. This was wrong. But even as these thoughts formed, another voice in her head, deeper and more insistent, was whispering a different message. What if it really was Thomas? What if he was alive and hiding here for some reason? What if he needed help? She opened her mouth to call out, to say his name into the darkness, but before she could make a sound, she heard it, footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from somewhere above her. There was a 3rd floor, the tower. Someone was in the tower. Every instinct had screamed at her to run, to get out of this house and never come back. But she didn't run. Instead, she moved toward the hallway, searching for stairs to the third floor. She found them at the end of the hall, a narrow spiral staircase that led upward into darkness. The steps were wood, worn smooth by generations of feet, and they wound around and around until felt dizzy. The door at the top was closed but not locked. His hand rested on the knob for a long moment while she gathered her courage. Then she turned it and pushed the door open. The tower room was circular, with windows on all sides offering a panoramic view of the neighborhood. In the fading afternoon light could see for blocks in every direction. She could see the house in the distance, its white columns gleaming. This room had been someone's refuge, their observation post. There was a telescope set up at one window, aimed directly at the estate. There was a desk covered with more photographs, more newspaper clippings, and what looked like journals filled with handwriting. But what captured attention, what made her heart stop and her breath catch and her eyes fill with tears, was the figure standing at the far window, silhouetted against the gray sky. A man, tall and thin, with hair that hung past his shoulders. He stood perfectly still, looking out at the rain, and even though couldn't see his face, even though 3 years had passed and grief had probably changed him beyond recognition, she knew. She knew with the certainty that only the heart possesses, beyond logic or reason or proof. She knew the way a mother knows her child, even though she had never given birth. She knew the way faith knows truth, even without evidence. "Thomas," she whispered, and the figure at the window went rigid, every muscle tensing. Slowly, so slowly, he began to turn toward her. The face that met her gaze was gaunt and bearded, with eyes that held a wildness had never seen before. His skin was pale, as if he hadn't seen sunlight in months. His clothes were worn and dirty, hanging loose on a frame that had lost too much weight. But it was him. Despite everything, despite the impossibility, it was Thomas, alive and staring at her with an expression that mixed fear, shame, and something that might have been relief. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The only sound was the rain against the windows and its ragged breathing. Then Thomas spoke, his voice rough from disuse or emotion or both. He said, using the nickname he had called her since childhood, "You weren't supposed to find me." Felt her legs weaken. She groped behind her for something to support herself and found the edge of the desk. Questions crowded her mind, thousands of them fighting to be asked first. Why are you here? Why did you let everyone think you were dead? Why have you been hiding? What happened to you? But the question that came out was simpler and more fundamental than any of those. "Are you real?" she asked. "Or am I losing my mind?" Thomas took a step toward her, then stopped, as if afraid to come closer. "I'm real," he said. "I'm sorry, God, I'm so sorry." The apology broke something in. She crossed the distance between them in 3 quick steps and pulled him into her arms, holding him tight the way she had when he was a child and had nightmares. He was so thin she could feel his ribs through his shirt. He smelled of unwashed clothes and the mustiness of the abandoned house. He stood stiff in her embrace for a moment. Then suddenly he was clinging to her, his whole body shaking with sobs that came from somewhere deep and broken inside him. They stood like that for a long time, an old black woman and a young white man who society would never recognize as family, but who were bound by something deeper than blood. Own tears soaked into Thomas's dirty shirt. Outside, the rain continued to fall, washing over the old house, washing over the secrets it had held for so long. When Thomas finally pulled away, wiping at his eyes with the back of his hand, got her first good look at him. The wildness in his eyes had softened, but she could see the damage there, the haunted look of someone who had been running from demons for too long. His hands were shaking. There were scars on his arms, some old and faded, some more recent. "You have to tell me what happened," said, her voice firm despite the trembling she felt inside. "You have to tell me why you're here, why you let everyone think you were dead. Your mother, Thomas. Do you know what this did to your mother?" Pain flashed across Thomas's face, sharp and raw. "I know," he said. "I know, and it kills me every day, but I couldn't go back, I can't go back, you don't understand." "Then help me understand," said. She pulled out the chair from the desk and sat down heavily, suddenly aware of how much her legs were shaking. "I'm not leaving here until you tell me everything, and then we're going to figure out what to do about this." Thomas shook his head violently. "No, no, you have to leave. You have to forget you saw me. If you tell anyone, if my parents find out, everything I've done will be for nothing." "What have you done?" asked. "What could possibly be worth putting your family through this kind of grief?" Thomas turned back to the window, staring out at the rain. When he spoke, his voice was so quiet had to strain to hear him. "I'm protecting them," he said. I'm protecting all of you, and if I go back, if anyone knows I'm alive, people will die, starting with you." Felt cold fear settle in her stomach, but she kept her voice steady. "That doesn't make any sense, Thomas. What people? Why would anyone die?" Thomas was quiet for so long that thought he might not answer. Then he turned back to her, and the look in his eyes made her understand that whatever had happened to him, whatever he had been through, it had fundamentally changed him. The carefree young man she had known was gone, replaced by someone harder and more damaged. "3 years ago," he said, "I witnessed something I wasn't supposed to see, something that involved very powerful people doing very illegal things. I didn't realize what I was seeing at the time, not until it was too late. By the time I understood, they already knew I knew. They made it very clear what would happen if I didn't disappear. They said if I went to the police, if I told my parents, if I did anything except vanish completely, they would kill everyone I loved. And they would make sure I watched before they killed me too." His hand went to her mouth. "Thomas, you need to go to the police right now. You need protection." "The police can't help," Thomas said bitterly. "Some of the people involved are the police. Others are politicians, judges, people with enough money and power to make problems disappear. People who can make anyone who crosses them disappear." He moved to the desk and opened one of the journals, flipping through pages covered in tight, cramped handwriting. "I've been documenting everything. Every name, every connection, every piece of evidence I can gather. I've been watching them, learning their patterns, trying to build a case that's so airtight they can't ignore it or bury it. But I'm not ready yet. If I surface now, before I have everything I need, they'll kill me and destroy whatever evidence I've gathered. And then they'll go after my family to make sure there are no loose ends." Looked at the journals, at the photographs, at the evidence of the isolated, paranoid life Thomas had been living for 3 years. Part of her wanted to believe he was telling the truth, that there really was a conspiracy so vast and dangerous that it required this level of sacrifice. But another part of her wondered if grief or trauma or mental illness had twisted his perception of reality. "Even if what you're saying is true," she said carefully, "you can't live like this forever. You can't watch your family from a distance and never let them know you're alive. Your mother has aged 10 years in the past 3. Your father barely speaks anymore. Had to take a year off from school because she couldn't function. You're killing them with this, Thomas. You're killing them just as surely as any conspiracy could." Thomas's face crumpled. "Do you think I don't know that?" he said, his voice breaking. "Do you think I don't hate myself for it every single day? I watch her through the telescope, my mom. I watch her walk through the house and I can see how broken she is and it destroys me. But at least she's alive. At least they're all alive. Spent that entire night in the tower room with Thomas, listening to his story unfold in fragments and broken sentences. He told her about the night 3 years ago when everything changed, when he had been working late at his internship at a prestigious investment firm in downtown Hartford. He had been making good money, learning the business, following in his father's successful footsteps even though law had never really been his passion. His real love had been photography, art, things his father dismissed as hobbies rather than careers. That night he had forgotten some documents in the office and had returned around 11 o'clock to retrieve them. The building had been dark except for a few offices on the top floor where the senior partners worked. Thomas had used his key card to enter through the side entrance, the one the cleaning crews used. He had taken the elevator up to the 14th floor where the intern bullpen was located, grabbed his forgotten folder, and was heading back to the elevator when he heard voices coming from the conference room. The conference room shouldn't have been occupied at that hour. Curious and perhaps hoping to impress whatever senior partner was working so late, Thomas had moved closer. The door was slightly ajar, and through the gap he could see inside. What he saw made him freeze in place, his breath catching in his throat. There were 5 men in the room. 2 of them he recognized immediately because their faces were constantly in the news. One was Senator Harrison Blake, who was running for governor at the time and was considered a shoo-in to win. The other was Judge Martin Westbrook, who had presided over some of the most high-profile cases in the state. The other 3 men Thomas didn't recognize, but they all had the look of people who were used to power and money. On the conference table were stacks of cash, more money than Thomas had ever seen in one place. Next to the cash were several large envelopes. The men were dividing the money, counting it carefully, making notes in ledgers. But it was the conversation that made Thomas understand he was witnessing something dangerous. They were discussing bribes, not in vague terms or corporate euphemisms, but in clear, direct language that left no room for misinterpretation. Judge Westbrook was being paid to rule in favor of certain companies in environmental cases. Senator Blake was being paid to kill legislation that would have tightened regulations on financial institutions. The other men represented various interests, from pharmaceutical companies to real estate developers, all of them buying influence, buying justice, buying the very system that was supposed to protect regular people. Thomas had stood frozen, unable to move, unable to process what he was seeing. He should have left immediately. He should have backed away silently and gotten out of the building. But he was young and shock made him clumsy. His folder slipped from his hands and hit the floor with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet hallway. The conversation in the conference room stopped immediately. Thomas heard chairs scraping, footsteps approaching. He ran, abandoning the folder, racing for the stairs instead of waiting for the elevator. He made it to his car and drove home with his heart pounding so hard he thought it might explode. He told himself they hadn't seen him. The hallway had been dark. They couldn't possibly know who had been there. But they knew. 2 days later, Thomas received a phone call. The voice on the other end was calm and professional, the kind of voice that might belong to someone offering a business opportunity or conducting a survey. The man identified himself as a representative of certain parties who preferred to remain anonymous. He said they knew Thomas had been in the building that night. He said they knew what Thomas had seen. And then he laid out what would happen next. Thomas would disappear. He would stage his own death in a way that was believable, that would not trigger an investigation. He would never contact his family again. He would never go to the police or the media. If he followed these instructions, his family would be safe. If he didn't, they would die. The man described in detail how it would happen, how his mother would be killed in a car accident, how his father would have a fatal heart attack, how his sister would be found dead from an apparent overdose. The descriptions were so specific, so coldly delivered that Thomas knew they weren't idle threats. "I didn't know what to do," Thomas told, his voice hollow with remembered fear. "I was 24 years old. I'd never faced anything more serious than a college exam, and suddenly I was being told to choose between my own life and my family's safety. So I chose. I drove my car to the bridge, left my wallet and phone on the seat, and walked away. I made it look like I'd jumped. And then I became a ghost." Listened to all of this with a growing sense of horror. She wanted to believe Thomas was exaggerating, that fear and stress had warped his memories. But the details were too specific, and the evidence all around her in the tower room suggested he had been living this nightmare for years. "But why stay so close?" she asked. "Why not leave Connecticut entirely? Why hide in this house where you can see your old life but can't be part of it?" Thomas's laugh was bitter and broken. "Because I'm not strong enough to go further. I've tried. 3 times I've packed up everything and planned to leave, to go somewhere far away where I could start over completely. But I can't do it. I can't leave them. Even if I can't be with them, even if they think I'm dead, I need to be able to see them to know they're okay. It's pathetic, I know, it's torture, but it's all I have." He gestured to the telescope at the window. "Every morning I watch my mother have her coffee on the patio. Every evening I watch my father come home from work. I've watched grow up through that lens. I saw her graduate from high school after I was already dead. I've watched them grieve for me, and it tears me apart, but at least I know they're alive. At least I know I made the right choice." Felt tears running down her face. "Thomas, baby, this isn't living. This is just a different kind of death. And what you're saying, these people who threatened you, how do you know they haven't forgotten about you? It's been 3 years. Maybe they've moved on. Maybe you could come forward now." Thomas shook his head violently. "They haven't forgotten. I know because I've been watching them too. Senator Blake won his election and became governor. Judge Westbrook just got appointed to the state Supreme Court. The network has only gotten bigger and more powerful. And I'm still gathering evidence. Every piece of corruption I can find, I document. Every connection, every transaction, I record. Someday, when I have enough, when I can guarantee that exposing them will mean they all go down at once with no chance of escaping or retaliating, then I'll come forward. But that day isn't here yet." He showed the journals, page after page of meticulous notes. Names, dates, amounts of money, descriptions of meetings observed from a distance. He had newspaper clippings that detailed various political decisions and legal rulings, with notes in the margins connecting them to the corruption he had witnessed. He had photographs taken with a telephoto lens showing various powerful men meeting in places they shouldn't be meeting, at times that suggested secrecy rather than legitimate business. It was the work of someone obsessed, someone who had dedicated every waking moment to a single purpose, but could also see that it was the work of someone intelligent and methodical. If even half of what Thomas had documented was true, the conspiracy he had stumbled upon was vast and deeply rooted in the state's power structure. "I believe you," said finally, the words surprising even herself. "I don't want to believe you. It would be easier if I thought you were sick, if I thought this was all in your head. But I believe you. What I don't know is what to do about it." Thomas looked at her with desperate hope in his eyes. "Don't do anything. Please, just forget you saw me. Go back to your life and pretend this never happened. That's the only way to keep you safe." Shook her head slowly. "You know I can't do that. You know I could never just walk away and leave you in this house, living like a ghost, destroying yourself with guilt and isolation. I've watched you grow up, Thomas. I've loved you like you were my own son. I'm not going to abandon you now." "Then what?" Thomas asked, his voice breaking. "What can you possibly do? You're a housekeeper, no offense, but you don't have power or connections. You can't protect yourself from these people, let alone protect my family or help me bring them down." The words stung, not because they were meant to hurt, but because they were true. Was a 63-year-old black woman who cleaned houses for a living. She had no college education, no money of her own, no influence in the corridors of power where Thomas's conspiracy operated. By any measure, she was powerless, but had lived long enough to know that power came in many forms, and that the powerful often underestimated those they considered beneath them. She had survived poverty, racism, the death of her husband, and decades of working in houses where she was treated as invisible. She had learned to see and hear things that people assumed she wouldn't notice or wouldn't understand. She had learned to navigate systems designed to keep her in her place. And she had learned that sometimes, being underestimated was its own kind of advantage. "You're right," she said. "I don't have power or connections, but I have something you don't have anymore. I have access to your parents' house. I have their trust. And I have the ability to move through the world without anyone paying attention to me. You know what you're missing in all this research, Thomas? You're missing what's happening inside your own family. You're missing conversations, documents, information that might be relevant to what you're investigating. Your father is a lawyer. He knows people, he has access to records. What if there's something in his files that could help you?" Thomas started to shake his head, but pressed on. "I'm not saying we tell him you're alive, but I can look. I can listen. I can be your eyes and ears in places you can't go, and if I find anything useful, I'll bring it to you. At the very least, I can keep you informed about how they're really doing, not just what you can see through a telescope." She could see Thomas struggling with the idea, wanting to accept her help, but afraid of putting her in danger. "If they find out you're helping me, if they even suspect it, they'll kill you," he said. "Then we'll have to make sure they don't find out," replied with more confidence than she felt. "I've been invisible to people like them my whole life. They don't see the help, Thomas. We're furniture to them, part of the background. That's our advantage." They talked through the night, working out a system. Would visit Thomas twice a week, always varying the days and times to avoid establishing a pattern. She would bring him food, supplies, anything he needed. She would also bring any information she could gather from the household. Thomas was reluctant, but could see that the prospect of having an ally, of not being completely alone anymore, was breaking down his resistance. As dawn began to lighten the sky outside the tower windows, prepared to leave, Thomas walked her down to the first floor, moving silently through the old house with the practice of someone who had learned every creaking floorboard and loose step. At the window where she had entered, he grabbed her hand. "I need you to promise me something," he said, his eyes intense in the gray morning light. "If anything happens, if you get any sense that you're in danger, you have to distance yourself from this immediately. Tell them I threatened you, tell them whatever you need to tell them, but save yourself. Don't be loyal to me if it means getting hurt. Promise me." Looked at this young man who had been forced to grow up too fast, who had sacrificed everything to protect his family, who was still trying to protect others even as he destroyed himself. She thought about all the promises she had made over the years, to herself and to others, about the promises that had been broken and the ones she had kept. This was one promise she knew she might not be able to keep, but she also knew it was what he needed to hear. "I promise," she said, and then she climbed out the window and hurried through the overgrown garden before anyone might see her leaving the abandoned house. She made it home just as her neighbors were beginning to stir, starting their Saturday morning routines. She let herself into her small apartment, the place that had been her refuge for 15 years, and sat down heavily on her worn couch. Her mind was racing, her heart pounding. Everything in her life had changed in the space of one night. She knew something that could destroy families, end careers, maybe even get her killed. and she had committed herself to helping Thomas, to being part of whatever came next. Didn't sleep that day. Instead, she sat at her kitchen table and thought about what she needed to do. She had told Thomas she could help him, but now she had to figure out how. She knew the house intimately, knew where Richard kept his files, knew Elizabeth's routines and habits. But she had never thought of that knowledge as anything other than professional competence. Now she had to think of it as intelligence, as actionable information that might matter. On Monday, she returned to work at the estate with new eyes. Everything looked the same, the gleaming surfaces and expensive furniture and carefully arranged photographs of a family that no longer existed in its original form, but saw it differently now. She saw potential sources of information. She saw opportunities. Elizabeth was in the breakfast room when arrived, picking at a piece of toast and staring out the window. She looked up when entered, offering a wan smile that didn't reach her eyes. Elizabeth had been beautiful once, the kind of beauty that came from good genes and expensive maintenance. But grief had carved away at that beauty, leaving her looking older and fragile. "Good morning," Elizabeth said softly. "There's coffee made if you'd like some." "Thank you, Mrs." replied, using the formal address Elizabeth preferred. In 15 years, she had never been invited to call her employer by her first name, and that small distance suddenly felt significant. Poured herself a cup of coffee and began her usual morning routine, wiping down counters that were already clean, organizing items that were already organized. But as she worked, she listened. Elizabeth made a phone call to her sister, discussing the upcoming anniversary of Thomas's death. Her voice broke as she talked about how she couldn't believe it had been 3 years, how she still expected him to walk through the door. His hand tightened on the dishcloth she was holding, her heart aching for this woman who was grieving a son who was alive less than a mile away. Later, Richard came down for his coffee before heading to the office. He barely acknowledged his presence as usual, but she heard him on the phone with someone discussing a case. The conversation was meaningless to her, legal jargon and procedural details, but she filed it away anyway. She was learning to pay attention to everything now, not knowing what might be important. That evening after her work was done made her first visit to Thomas at the house. She brought groceries, toiletries, and a notebook where she had written down everything she had observed that day. Thomas read through her notes carefully, asking questions about context and timing. Most of it was useless, just the mundane details of a household going through its daily routines. But he seemed grateful anyway, grateful to know something about his family beyond what he could see through his telescope. Found herself caught in a strange double life over the following weeks. By day, she was the same efficient, quiet housekeeper she had always been, moving through the mansion with practiced invisibility. But now every conversation she overheard, every document she glimpsed, every visitor who came to the house was and analyzed. She had become a spy in a war she barely understood, gathering intelligence for a soldier hiding in an abandoned tower. The work was exhausting and nerve-wracking, had never been good at deception. Her whole life had been built on honesty and hard work, on doing right by people even when they didn't notice or appreciate it. Now she was lying every day, keeping the biggest secret imaginable from people who trusted her. The weight of it pressed down on her like a physical burden. Her visits to Thomas became the axis around which her life revolved. Twice a week, she would make her way to the house, always varying her route, always checking to make sure no one was following her. The paranoia that had consumed Thomas was beginning to infect her too. She found herself looking over her shoulder, wondering if the car parked across the street from her apartment was just a neighbor or something more sinister. Thomas was deteriorating. Could see it in the way his hands shook more each time she visited, in the dark circles under his eyes that suggested he wasn't sleeping, in the manic energy with which he pored over every scrap of information she brought him. He had lost more weight, his cheekbones sharp enough to cut. Sometimes when she arrived, she would find him standing at the telescope for hours, motionless, watching his family's house with an intensity that frightened her. "You need to eat more," she scolded him one evening, unpacking the groceries she had brought. "You're wasting away, Thomas. What good is all this evidence going to do if you work yourself to death before you can use it?" Thomas barely looked up from the newspaper he was studying, another article about Governor Blake's administration. "I'm fine," he muttered, his voice distracted. "Look at this. Blake just appointed 3 new members to the Environmental Protection Board. All of them have connections to industries that would benefit from looser regulations. It's all right here if you know how to read it." Wanted to shake him to force him to see what he was doing to himself, but she also understood. This investigation, this accumulation of evidence, was the only thing giving his exile meaning. Without it, he was just a coward who had abandoned his family. With it, he could tell himself he was a hero preparing to bring down corruption. The truth was probably somewhere in between, but wasn't going to be the one to point that out. 6 weeks into her new role as spy and confidant, made a discovery that changed everything. She was cleaning Richard's home office, a room she usually only entered once a week to dust and vacuum. Richard was particular about his office, always locking away files and papers before arrived. But on this day, he had been called away suddenly for an emergency at work, and he had left in such a hurry that his desk was covered with documents. Knew she shouldn't look. It was a violation of privacy, a breach of trust. But she also knew that Thomas was right about one thing. His father's work might hold clues to the conspiracy he was investigating. So she pulled out her phone, the cheap smartphone she had bought specifically for taking pictures of documents, and began photographing the papers on Richard's desk. Most of it was incomprehensible legal language, contracts and motions and briefs that meant nothing to her. But one file caught her attention. It was labeled Blake Administration Potential Conflicts, and it was full of notes in Richard's handwriting. She photographed every page, her hands shaking, her ears straining for the sound of the front door opening. When she brought the photographs to Thomas that evening, she could barely contain her excitement. "I found something," she said, thrusting her phone at him. "In your father's office. I don't know what it means, but it mentions Blake." Thomas's hands trembled as he took the phone, swiping through the images. His face went pale, then flushed, his eyes growing wider with each photo. "Oh my God," he whispered. "Oh my God, do you know what this is?" Shook her head, waiting for him to explain. "My father is investigating Blake too," Thomas said, his voice filled with wonder and fear. "These notes, they're about potential corruption in Blake's administration. Dad's firm must have been hired by someone who suspects what's going on. He's looking into the same things I am, but from a different angle." Thomas stood up and began packing the tower room, his mind clearly racing. "This changes everything. If my father already suspects corruption, if he's already investigating, then maybe I don't need to stay hidden. Maybe I could come forward, tell him what I saw, give him my evidence. Together we could build a case strong enough to protect us from retaliation." Felt a surge of hope, but also caution. You don't know how much he knows. You don't know if he's aware of how dangerous these people are. If you appear suddenly after 3 years, it might put him in more danger, not less. Thomas nodded, his excitement dimming. "You're right. I need to know more. I need to know exactly what he's investigating and how far along he is. Can you get me more? Can you find the rest of his files on this?" Hesitated. What she had done today had been opportunistic, taking advantage of a lucky break. What Thomas was asking now was different. He was asking her to actively search through Richard's private files, to deliberately invade his privacy in a systematic way. It was one thing to photograph papers left out on a desk. It was another to go rifling through locked drawers and filing cabinets. But looking at Thomas's face, seeing the hope there for the first time in weeks, found herself nodding. "I'll try," she said. "But you have to understand he keeps most of his files locked. I don't have keys and I'm not going to break into anything. If I can find more, I will, but I can't promise anything." Over the next 2 weeks became bolder in her information gathering. She learned Richard's routines, figured out when he was most likely to leave the office unlocked, when he took calls in other rooms. She discovered that he kept some files in a cabinet in the library, files he must have considered less sensitive since they weren't locked in his office safe. Among these files, she found more notes about the Blake investigation, as well as references to other cases that might be related. She photographed everything she could, her heart pounding every time she heard a noise in the house. Twice she nearly got caught, having to quickly hide her phone and pretend to be dusting when Richard or Elizabeth walked by. The stress was wearing on her. She wasn't sleeping well, her appetite had disappeared, and she found herself jumping at shadows. Thomas, meanwhile, was like a man possessed. He spent hours analyzing the documents brought him, cross-referencing them with his own research, building connections and timelines. He had created an entire wall in the tower room covered with papers and photographs, connected by strings in a pattern that looked like something from a detective movie. To it looked like the work of a madman, but Thomas insisted there was logic to it, patterns that were becoming clear. "It's bigger than I thought," he told her one night, his eyes bright with fevered intensity. "The corruption doesn't stop with Blake and Westbrook. It's systemic. There are connections to other states, to federal officials. What I witnessed 3 years ago wasn't an isolated incident. It was just one node in a network that's been operating for decades. Looked at the wall of conspiracy, at the young man who had sacrificed his life to expose it, and felt a deep sense of unease. Thomas, you're starting to scare me. You sound like those people who think everything is connected, who see patterns that aren't really there. Maybe you should step back, get some perspective. Thomas turned on her with sudden anger, his face flushed. You think I'm crazy? You think I'm making this up? Look at the evidence, it's all there. My father is seeing it too, that's why he's investigating. Your father is investigating specific allegations as part of his job, said carefully. That's different from believing there's some massive conspiracy that controls everything. You need to be careful not to let this consume you, Thomas. You need to stay rational if you're going to fight these people effectively. But Thomas wasn't listening. He had turned back to his wall of evidence, muttering to himself, making new connections, left that night feeling more worried than ever. She was starting to wonder if she had made a terrible mistake by agreeing to help him. What if Thomas really was losing his grip on reality? What if his isolation and obsession had broken something fundamental in his mind? The breaking point came 2 months into double life. She arrived at the house one Monday morning to find the place in chaos. Police cars were parked in the driveway. Elizabeth was in the living room, sobbing, and Richard was being led out of the house in handcuffs. Stood frozen in the kitchen doorway, watching the scene unfold. A detective she didn't recognize was talking to Elizabeth, trying to calm her down. Through the window, could see neighbors gathering on the street, phones out, recording everything. What happened? Managed to ask one of the uniformed officers standing in the foyer. The officer looked at her with the casual disregard people often showed to household staff. Mr. has been arrested for obstruction of justice and evidence tampering. Apparently, he was investigating corruption allegations and crossed some lines. That's all I can tell you. Felt the world tilt beneath her feet. This couldn't be coincidence. Richard had been investigating Blake, and now suddenly he was being arrested. The conspiracy Thomas feared was real, and it was moving against them. She managed to get through the day in a fog, comforting Elizabeth as best she could, answering questions from other officers who came through the house. All the while, her mind was racing. She needed to tell Thomas. She needed to warn him that things were escalating, that the people he feared had just demonstrated their power by taking down his father. But she couldn't leave. Elizabeth was falling apart, clinging to Sarm, begging her not to go. The house was full of police and lawyers and people from Richard's firm. Was trapped, watching the hours tick by, desperate to get to Thomas, but unable to abandon Elizabeth in her hour of need. It wasn't until nearly 10 o'clock that night that finally made it to the house. She ran the last 3 blocks, her aging knees protesting, her breath coming in gasps. She climbed through the ground floor window and raced up the stairs to the tower, calling Thomas's name. He was at the telescope when she burst in, and he turned to look at her with eyes that held no surprise, only resignation. "I know," he said before she could speak. "I watched it happen. I saw them take him away." Bent over, hands on her knees, trying to catch her breath. "Thomas, this proves you were right. This proves how dangerous these people are. We need to do something. We need to help your father." Thomas shook his head slowly. "We can't help him, don't you see? This is exactly what they do. He got too close to the truth, so they're destroying him. They've probably planted evidence, manufactured crimes. By the time his case goes to trial, they'll have him so tangled up in false charges that no one will believe anything he says about corruption." "Then we tell people what you know," said desperately. "We go to the media, we go to the FBI, we tell them everything." "And they'll kill my mother," Thomas said flatly. "And my sister, and you, that was the deal, remember. I stay silent and everyone lives. I break silence and everyone dies. My father broke the rules by investigating too deeply, and now he's paying the price. But he's alive. They arrested him instead of killing him because a prominent lawyer dying would attract too much attention. But the rest of you, you're not protected by being public figures. You're vulnerable." Sank into a chair, the full weight of their situation crushing down on her. "So what do? We just let your father go to prison for crimes he didn't commit. We just keep hiding and gathering evidence that we'll never use." Thomas turned back to the window, staring out at the night. "I don't know," he said quietly. "For the first time since this started, I honestly don't know what to do." They sat in silence for a long time, 2 people trapped by circumstances they couldn't control, holding secrets that were destroying them. Outside, the city continued its normal rhythms. oblivious to the quiet tragedy unfolding in an abandoned tower. Finally spoke, "I need to tell you something and you're not going to like it, but I've been thinking about it for weeks now and I can't keep quiet anymore." Thomas looked at her warily. "What?" "I think you need to talk to your father," said. "Not about coming back from the dead, not yet, but anonymously. You could write him a letter, send him copies of your evidence. He's a lawyer, he knows how to use information. He could build a case using what you have without knowing where it came from." Thomas was already shaking his head. "Any contact is too risky. They might be monitoring his communications now that they've arrested him. If they trace anything back to me, if they figure out I'm alive, the deal is broken." "The deal is already broken," said her voice rising. "They arrested your father. They're not keeping their end of the bargain, so why should you keep yours?" "Because my father being in jail is better than my mother being dead," Thomas shouted back. "Don't you understand? As long as I'm silent, as long as I'm dead, they have no reason to hurt my family further. My father's arrest is a warning, a reminder of what they can do, but it's not the worst they can do. The worst is still available to them if I step out of line." Stood up, her own anger rising. "You know what I think, Thomas? I think you're afraid. I think you've been hiding in this tower for so long that you've forgotten how to fight. You tell yourself you're gathering evidence, you're building a case, but really you're just hiding. You're paralyzed by fear, and you're using the threat to your family as an excuse to never take action." Thomas's face went white, then red. "How dare you?" he said, his voice shaking. "You have no idea what I've sacrificed. You have no idea what it's like to choose between your own existence and your family's safety." "You're right," said her voice softening. "I don't know what that's like, but I do know what it's like to watch someone destroy themselves out of fear. I've watched you waste away in this house for 3 years. I've watched you become a ghost even though you're still breathing. And now I'm watching your father pay the price for trying to do what you're too scared to do yourself." The words hung in the air between them, harsh and true. Thomas turned away from her, his shoulders shaking. When he spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "What if I try to fight them and I lose? What if I come forward and they kill my family anyway and everything I've done is for nothing? At least this way, hiding, staying silent, I know they're safe. I can see them through the telescope and know they're alive. If I give that up, if I try to fight and fail, I'll have nothing left." Moved to stand beside him, looking out the window at the house in the distance, its windows glowing warmly in the night. "You already have nothing, baby. You just haven't admitted it to yourself yet. Your family isn't safe. Your father just got arrested. Your mother is drinking herself to sleep every night. Your sister dropped out of school and is seeing a therapist 3 times a week for depression. They're not okay, Thomas. Your sacrifice isn't protecting them from pain. It's just a different kind of pain than the one you're afraid of." Thomas was crying now, silent tears running down his gaunt face. Put her arm around him, this broken young man who had tried to do the right thing and had lost himself in the process. "I'm so tired," Thomas whispered. "I'm so tired of being afraid all the time. I'm tired of watching my family from a distance. I'm tired of living like this. But I don't know how to stop. I don't know how to be brave enough to fight them." "You don't have to be brave all at once," said gently. "You just have to take one step, just one, and then another. We'll figure it out together." Thomas leaned against her, exhausted and defeated and terrified, and held him, this young man she loved like a son, and wondered what she had committed them both to. She didn't have a plan. She didn't know how to fight powerful men who could destroy lives with a phone call. She was just an old housekeeper who had stumbled into something far beyond her understanding. But she also knew that she couldn't walk away now. She had made a choice when she climbed through that window 2 months ago. She had chosen to stand with Thomas, to help him however she could. And that meant she would keep standing with him, even when she didn't know what to do next, even when she was as frightened as he was. They stayed in the tower until dawn, not talking much, just sitting together in the growing light. When finally left to go home and prepare for another day at the house, she turned back to look at Thomas one last time. He was at the telescope again, watching his family's house, keeping his lonely vigil. Made herself a promise as she walked through the overgrown garden of the house. Somehow, someway, she was going to find a way to help Thomas come home. She didn't know how yet. She didn't know if it was even possible. But she was going to try because that's what you did for the people you loved, even when it was dangerous, even when it seemed impossible. You tried. The weeks following Richard's arrest were a blur of legal proceedings, media attention, and growing desperation. Watched as the family she had served for 15 years crumbled under the weight of scandal and uncertainty. Elizabeth stopped eating properly, stopped maintaining her appearance, stopped caring about the social standing she had once valued so highly. The house that had always been immaculate began to show signs of neglect because Elizabeth no longer cared whether surfaces were dusted or floors were polished. Did her best to hold things together, but it was like trying to bail water out of a sinking ship with a teaspoon. The media had descended on the family like vultures, camping outside the gates, shouting questions whenever anyone entered or left. The story was perfect for the news cycle. A prominent lawyer arrested for corruption, caught doing the very thing his wealthy clients hired him to prevent. Never mind that Richard had been investigating corruption, not participating in it. The narrative had been set, and the truth was buried under layers of manufactured evidence and leaked information that painted Richard as the villain. Came home from college, thinner and more fragile than had ever seen her. She moved through the house like a ghost, barely speaking, barely eating. At 21, she looked like she had aged a decade. She spent most of her time in her room, and when she did emerge, her eyes were red from crying. Wanted desperately to tell the truth, to say that Thomas was alive and watching over them all, that her brother hadn't abandoned them by dying but had sacrificed himself to protect them. But she couldn't. Thomas had made her promise to keep his secret, and she understood why. If knew Thomas was alive, she would want to see him, and any contact between them could trigger the retaliation they all feared. So kept quiet and did what she could to support the family through their crisis. She cooked meals that often went uneaten. She kept the house clean and orderly, maintaining routines even when routines seemed pointless. She listened to Elizabeth's rambling, tear-stained monologues about how everything had fallen apart, how she had lost her son, and now she was losing her husband too. At night would go to the house and report everything to Thomas. He would listen with an intensity that bordered on manic, taking notes, asking questions, trying to find patterns in the chaos. His wall of conspiracy had grown to cover almost every surface of the tower room. He had stopped sleeping regular hours, instead napping in short bursts whenever exhaustion overwhelmed him. "They're systematically destroying my father," Thomas said one night, his voice hoarse from lack of sleep. "Look at the pattern. First they arrest him on false charges, then they leak information to the press to poison public opinion. They're making sure that by the time he goes to trial, everyone will already believe he's guilty. It's textbook character assassination." Looked at the wall covered in newspaper clippings, legal documents, and handwritten notes. Thomas had tracked every article written about Richard's case, every television segment, every social media post. He had identified journalists who seemed to be receiving inside information and connected them to people in Blake's administration. The pattern was clear if you knew to look for it, but to the general public, it just looked like a legitimate news story about a corrupt lawyer. "Your father's defense team must see what's happening," said. "Surely they're fighting back." Thomas shook his head bitterly. "His lawyers are good, but they're not equipped for this. They're thinking like lawyers, looking at the legal case, the evidence, the procedures. They don't understand that this isn't really a legal battle. It's a political one. The courtroom is just the stage where the performance happens, but the real decisions are being made elsewhere." "Then we need to make those decision-makers pay attention," said. "We need to take what you know and use it." "How?" Thomas asked, his voice desperate. "I've been asking myself that question every day for 3 years, and I still don't have an answer. If I go public with what I know, I become a target. They'll discredit me, maybe kill me, definitely go after my family. The evidence I have is good, but is it good enough to guarantee they all go down at once? I don't think so. There are too many of them, too many connections, too much power." Sat down heavily in the chair she had come to think of as hers during these nightly visits. She was exhausted, physically and emotionally. She had been maintaining her double life for months now, and the strain was showing. She had lost weight, her hands trembled sometimes, and she had started taking pills for anxiety that she got from a clinic without telling anyone. "What if we did it differently?" she said slowly, an idea forming. "What if instead of you going public, we leaked the information anonymously, to the press, to the FBI, to whoever might act on it?" Thomas had clearly thought of this before. "I've considered it. The problem is that anonymous tips are easy to ignore or discredit, especially when they're accusing powerful people. And if the information can be traced back to me, we're back to the same problem. They'll know I'm alive, they'll know I broke silence, and they'll retaliate." "What if it couldn't be traced back to you?" pressed. "What if the information came from a source they had no reason to connect to you?" Thomas looked at her with sudden interest. "What are you suggesting?" Took a deep breath, knowing she was about to propose something dangerous, possibly foolish, but unable to see another option. I'm suggesting that I could be that source. I work in your father's house. I have access to his files, his computers. If information about corruption in Blake's administration came from me, from someone who found it while working in Richard's home office, it would make sense. They would assume I stumbled across your father's investigation and decided to do something with it. They wouldn't have any reason to think it came from you. Thomas was shaking his head before she even finished. Absolutely not. No way, that would put you directly in their crosshairs. You've seen what they did to my father. They would destroy you, and they wouldn't be gentle about it. I'm an old black woman who cleans houses, said quietly. The public loves stories about powerless people standing up to the powerful. The media would eat it up. It would be much harder for them to discredit me than it would be to discredit you or your father. I'm nobody. I have nothing to lose. That makes me dangerous in a different way. You have your life to lose, Thomas said firmly. Your safety, your peace, I won't let you put yourself at risk like that. Smiled sadly. Baby, I put myself at risk the moment I climbed through the window of this house and found you alive. I've been at risk every day since then. At least this way, the risk might actually accomplish something. They argued about it for hours, but could see that Thomas was beginning to waver. The truth was, they were running out of options. Richard's trial was scheduled to begin in 6 weeks. Without intervention, he would almost certainly be convicted and sent to prison. The family would be destroyed, and the corruption Thomas had witnessed would continue unchecked. Something had to be done, and his plan, as risky as it was the best option they had. Over the next 2 weeks, they refined the plan, would discover documents in Richard's home office that detailed corruption in the Blake administration. She would take these documents to a journalist, someone with a reputation for integrity and a history of standing up to powerful interests. The journalist would investigate, verify what they could, and publish the story. The resulting attention would make it harder for Blake and his associates to retaliate without drawing even more scrutiny. Thomas spent countless hours selecting which documents to include, which pieces of evidence were most compelling and most verifiable. He created a dossier that combined his own research with information from Richard's files, presenting a clear picture of corruption that went from bribes in corporate boardrooms all the way to the governor's office. His role was to be the concerned citizen, the who had stumbled across information too important to ignore. She would claim that while cleaning Richard's office, she had found files that suggested he had been investigating corruption, files that might explain why he was being prosecuted. She would say that she believed Richard was being framed, that he was a victim rather than a perpetrator, and that the real criminals were the ones he had been investigating. The journalist they chose was Daniel Torres, a reporter for the Hartford Chronicle who had won awards for investigative journalism and had a reputation for not being intimidated by powerful people. Made the initial contact through an anonymous email account Thomas had set up, using a computer at the public library. Torres was intrigued but cautious, requesting a face-to-face meeting before he would commit to investigating. The meeting was set for a coffee shop in downtown Hartford, neutral territory where both of them could feel relatively safe. Dressed carefully for the occasion, choosing her church clothes, wanting to project respectability and trustworthiness. She carried a folder with copies of the documents Thomas had selected, her hands trembling slightly as she walked into the coffee shop. Daniel Torres was younger than she had expected, maybe in his mid-30s, with the intense eyes of someone who had seen too much corruption and refused to become cynical about it. He stood when she approached, shaking her hand with a firm grip. "Mrs. Washington," he said, using the name had given him. "That's right," said, sitting down across from him. "Thank you for meeting with me." Torres had a recorder on the table between them. "Do you mind if I record this conversation, just for my notes?" Hesitated, then nodded. Thomas had prepared her for this, had coached her on what to say and how to say it. Still, her heart was pounding as Torres pressed the record button. "Tell me why you wanted to meet," Torres said gently. "Your email mentioned you had information about the case." Took a breath and began the story she and Thomas had crafted. She explained that she worked as a housekeeper for the family, that she had been with them for 15 years. She talked about the family's grief over losing Thomas, about how Richard had thrown himself into work after his son's death, about how the arrest had everyone. "I clean Mister's office every week," said, following the script. "Usually he locks everything away before I come in, but the day he was arrested, he left in such a hurry that he didn't secure his files. I saw documents spread across his desk, and I couldn't help but look at them. What I saw suggested that Mr. was investigating corruption, not participating in it. Tors was taking notes, his expression neutral. That's a serious allegation. Do you have any proof? Slid the folder across the table. I made copies. I know I probably shouldn't have, but I felt like someone needed to know what he was really working on. Someone needed to know that maybe he was being set up. Tors opened the folder and began reading. Watched his expression change as he worked through the documents. His eyes widened, his jaw clenched, and he looked up at her with a mixture of surprise and suspicion. "Where did you really get these?" he asked bluntly. "Because some of this information, there's no way it was just sitting in office. This is detailed intelligence about transactions, meetings, communications. This is the kind of information that takes months or years to gather." Had prepared for this question, but her mouth still went dry. Mr. is a thorough man. He's been working on this investigation for a long time. What you're seeing is the result of extensive research. Tors studied her face for a long moment. "Mrs. Washington, I don't know who you really are or where you really got this information, but I can tell you're not telling me everything. If I'm going to run with this story, if I'm going to stake my reputation on these allegations, I need to know the whole truth." Felt panic rising in her chest. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Tors was supposed to be grateful for the information, excited about the story. He wasn't supposed to question her credibility or demand more information than she was prepared to give. "I've told you everything I can tell you," said, trying to keep her voice steady. "If that's not enough, then I guess we're done here." She started to stand to leave, but Tors put his hand on the folder, stopping her. "Wait, please sit down. I'm not trying to intimidate you or call you a liar. I'm just trying to understand the situation so I can protect both of us. Allegations like these against people this powerful, they need to be airtight. I need to be able to defend my sources and my information." Sat back down slowly. "What do you want me to say?" Tors leaned forward, his voice low and urgent. "I want you to tell me if there's any possibility that this information was obtained illegally. I want you to tell me if there are other people involved in this that I should know about. And I want you to tell me if you understand how much danger you might be putting yourself in by bringing this to me." Looked at this young journalist, this man who made his living exposing secrets and holding powerful people accountable, and saw that he was genuinely concerned for her safety. It almost made her laugh. Here she was, worried about protecting Thomas, and Tors was worried about protecting her. Everyone was trying to protect everyone else, and in the meantime, the corrupt people at the center of it all continued operating with impunity. "I understand the danger," said quietly. "I understand it better than you know, but I also understand that sometimes you have to take risks to do what's right. Mr. is a good man who is trying to fight corruption, and he's being punished for it. His family is being destroyed. If I can help stop that, even a little bit, then the risk is worth it." Tors studied her for another long moment, then nodded slowly. "Okay, I'll investigate this. I'll verify what I can and see if there's a story here. But I need you to understand something, Mrs. Washington. If I publish this, if I go after Governor Blake and the people connected to him, they're going to come after my sources. They're going to try to figure out who gave me this information. I'll protect you as best I can, but there are no guarantees. Are you sure you want to do this?" Thought about Thomas in his tower, watching his family through a telescope, living half a life. She thought about Richard in jail, facing charges for crimes he didn't commit. She thought about Elizabeth drinking herself to sleep and crying in her room. She thought about all the years she had spent being invisible, being overlooked, being underestimated by people who never saw her as fully human. Daniel Tors worked fast. Within 3 days of their meeting, he had enough of the information in his documents to know he was sitting on the story of his career. He made follow-up calls, too, asking clarifying questions, requesting additional information. Each time, coordinated with Thomas, making sure their story remained consistent, making sure nothing they said could lead back to Thomas's hiding place. On a Thursday morning, 2 weeks after his meeting with Tors, the Hartford Chronicle published its first article. The headline read, "Governor Blake's administration under investigation for corruption." The story detailed a pattern of bribery, influence peddling, and obstruction of justice that went back years, and involved some of the most powerful people in the state. Tors named names, cited specific transactions, and provided documentation that was difficult to dismiss as conspiracy theory or political attack. The article didn't mention by name. Tors had agreed to keep her identity confidential, referring to her only as a source familiar with an ongoing private investigation. But knew, It was only a matter of time before people started asking questions about who that source might be. The response was immediate and explosive. Other news outlets picked up the story. Political opponents of Governor Blake began calling for investigations. Social media erupted with debates and accusations. Within 48 hours, the FBI announced it was opening an inquiry into the allegations. Within 72 hours, Governor Blake held a press conference denying everything and claiming he was the victim of a political witch hunt. Watched it all unfold from the house, where she continued her work as if nothing had changed, as if she hadn't just set in motion events that would reshape state politics. Elizabeth was glued to the television, watching every development with an expression of confused hope. "Have you seen this?" Elizabeth asked, gesturing at the news. "They're saying that Richard might have been telling the truth about investigating corruption. They're saying he might have been framed. Do you think it's possible? Do you think there's hope?" Kept her expression carefully neutral. "I don't know, Mrs. I hope so. I've always believed Mr. was a good man." Came downstairs for the first time in days, drawn by the commotion. She stood next to her mother, reading the news crawler at the bottom of the screen. "If this is true," she said quietly, "if Dad was really investigating these people and they went after him to shut him up, then maybe he can get out of this. Maybe the charges will be dropped." Wanted to tell them yes, wanted to promise them that everything would be okay now. But she had lived long enough to know that justice was never guaranteed, especially when fighting against people who had spent years learning how to protect themselves. That night, when made her way to the house, she found Thomas in a state she had never seen before. He was packing the tower room like a caged animal, his eyes wild with a mixture of excitement and terror. "It's working," he said as soon as she entered. "Tor's article is working. People are paying attention. The FBI is investigating. This is what I've been working toward for 3 years, and it's finally happening." Could hear the but coming before he said it. "But I'm terrified," Thomas continued. "What if it's not enough? What if Blake and the others manage to cover this up too? What if they figure out where the information really came from? What if they hurt you or my family in retaliation?" Sat down, suddenly feeling every one of her 63 years. "There are no guarantees, Thomas, you know that, but doing nothing was also dangerous. At least now there's a chance for real change." Over the following weeks, the scandal grew like a wildfire. Tor's published follow-up articles, each one adding new details and new names to the web of corruption. Other journalists began their own investigations, finding additional evidence that corroborated the original reporting. Federal investigators obtained warrants and began interviewing witnesses. Several people in Blake's administration resigned or were placed on leave. And then, on a Monday morning 5 weeks after the first article, Judge Martin Westbrook was arrested. Was at the house when the news broke. She watched Elizabeth and hug each other and cry with relief, because Westbrook's arrest gave credibility to Richard's investigation. If a state Supreme Court judge could be corrupt, if he could be arrested based on evidence of bribery, then maybe Richard really had been trying to expose wrongdoing rather than participate in it. That afternoon, Richard's lawyers filed a motion to dismiss the charges against him, arguing prosecutorial misconduct and suggesting that the charges had been politically motivated to silence his investigation. The motion included references to Tor's articles and the ongoing FBI investigation. It was a long shot, but it was a shot they hadn't had before. Left work early that day, claiming she wasn't feeling well. Elizabeth barely noticed, too wrapped up in calling her lawyer and trying to arrange a visit with Richard. Made her way to the house with her heart pounding, needing to share the news with Thomas, needing to see his reaction. She found him at the telescope, as always, but this time his hands were steady and his eyes were clear. He turned when she entered, and for the first time in years, she saw something in his face that looked like hope. "Westbrook was arrested," said, even though she knew he had probably already seen the news. Thomas nodded. "I watched it happen. Through the telescope, I could see my mother and watching the television. I could see them crying, hugging each other. They looked happy. For the first time since I died, they looked genuinely happy." Moved to stand beside him at the window. "Your father might get out of this now. The case against him is falling apart." "I know," Thomas said quietly, "and that's wonderful. But it's also terrifying because it means I have to make a decision I've been avoiding for 3 years." Knew what he meant. "You're thinking about coming home." Thomas turned to face her, his expression anguished. "How can I? How do I walk back into their lives after letting them think I was dead for 3 years? How do I explain what I did? They'll hate me, they'll never forgive me. Took his hands, these hands that had aged beyond their years, that trembled with fear and hope. They'll be angry, yes, they'll be hurt, but they'll also be grateful to have you back. You're their son, their brother. That doesn't change just because you made a terrible choice in an impossible situation. What if the threat is still real? Thomas asked. What if coming forward puts them in danger? Had thought about this question constantly over the past weeks. The situation has changed. Blake's administration is under investigation. Westbrook has been arrested. The conspiracy you witnessed is being exposed. The people who threatened you are fighting for their own survival now. They don't have time or resources to go after you. And if you come forward now, if you tell your story as part of the ongoing investigation, you become a protected witness rather than a target. Your testimony could help put these people away for good. Thomas pulled away from her, moving to his wall of evidence. He stared at the thousands of hours of work, the connections and patterns he had documented, the obsession that had consumed his life. All of this, he said, gesturing at the wall, all of this research, all of this evidence I've gathered, it was supposed to keep me safe. It was supposed to be my insurance policy. If I come forward now and give it all to the FBI, I have nothing left. I have no leverage, no protection. You'll have your family, said simply. You'll have your life back. Isn't that worth more than leverage or insurance policies? Thomas was quiet for a long time, staring at his wall. Then slowly he began to tear it down. He pulled down newspaper clippings, photographs, documents, all the pieces of his 3-year obsession and put them in boxes. Watched, understanding that this was his way of making the decision, of committing to a path forward even when he was terrified of what that path might hold. When the wall was bare and the boxes were full, Thomas turned to with tears streaming down his face. "Will you help me?" he asked. "Will you help me figure out how to come home?" Pulled him into her arms, this broken young man who had lost so much trying to do the right thing. "Of course I will, baby. Of course I will." They spent that night planning. They decided that Thomas would go directly to the FBI rather than to his family first. He would offer his testimony and his evidence in exchange for protection. He would explain what he had witnessed 3 years ago and why he had disappeared. He would let the authorities determine how to use his information most effectively. Only after the FBI had secured his testimony and ensured his safety would Thomas contact his family. Would help facilitate that reunion, would be there to support both Thomas and through what would undoubtedly be a difficult and emotional process. 3 days later drove Thomas to the FBI field office in New Haven. He had cleaned himself up, cut his hair, borrowed some of Richard's old clothes that had smuggled out of the house. He looked almost like the young man he had been 3 years ago, though his eyes still held the shadows of everything he had been through. At the entrance to the federal building, Thomas hesitated, his hand on the door. "What if this is a mistake?" he asked. "What if I walk in there and everything falls apart?" Squeezed his arm. "Then we'll deal with it, but I don't think it's a mistake, Thomas. I think it's the bravest thing you've ever done." Thomas took a deep breath, squared his shoulders, and walked through the door. Waited in the car, her hands gripping the steering wheel, praying for a positive outcome even though she wasn't sure she believed in prayer anymore. 4 hours later, Thomas emerged with 2 FBI agents. He looked exhausted but also lighter somehow, as if a great weight had been lifted from his shoulders. One of the agents approached his car and explained that Thomas would need to stay in protective custody for a few days while they processed his information and determined the full extent of the threat. They thanked for her role in bringing Thomas forward and assured her that she would also be placed under protection if necessary. The next week was a blur of activity. The FBI confirmed Thomas's story and began using his evidence to build cases against multiple defendants. Governor Blake was questioned by federal investigators. More arrests were made. The scandal that had been brewing for weeks exploded into a full-blown crisis that dominated every news cycle. Richard's charges were dismissed. The prosecutor in his case was reassigned after evidence emerged suggesting he had been coordinating with Blake's office. Richard walked out of jail to a crowd of reporters and cameras, looking thinner and older but vindicated. He gave a brief statement thanking his legal team and his family, and then he went home to his wife and daughter. Was at the house when he arrived. She watched from the kitchen as Elizabeth threw herself into Richard's arms, sobbing with relief. She watched cling to her father, both of them crying. It was a beautiful reunion, made more poignant by the knowledge that an even bigger reunion was coming. 2 days later, the FBI determined it was safe for Thomas to contact his family. They arranged for the meeting to take place at a secure location, with agents present in case there were any security concerns. Was invited to attend in recognition of her role in bringing Thomas home. The look on Elizabeth's face when Thomas walked into the room was something would remember for the rest of her life. Shock, disbelief, joy, anger, confusion, all flashing across her features in rapid succession. She stood frozen for a moment, her hand over her mouth, tears already streaming down her face. Then she was moving, crossing the room in a few quick steps, reaching for her son with shaking hands. "Thomas," she whispered, touching his face as if to verify he was real. "Thomas, is it really you?" "Hi, Mom," Thomas said, his own voice breaking. "I'm so sorry, I'm so sorry." Elizabeth pulled him into a fierce embrace, holding him like she would never let go. Richard was next, his lawyer composure crumbling as he wrapped his arms around his son. Was crying so hard she could barely stand, but she managed to join the family hug, all four clinging to each other in a tangle of arms and tears and overwhelming emotion. Stood to the side, tears running down her own face, watching this family knit itself back together. No one was paying attention to her, which was fine. This was their moment, not hers. She had played her part, done what needed to be done, and now they could begin to heal. But then Thomas pulled away from his family and turned too. He crossed the room and took her hands, looking at her with an expression of gratitude so profound it made her heart ache. "Mom, Dad," he said, still holding his hands, "there's someone I need you to meet properly. I know you've employed her for years, but you don't really know her. She's the person who found me when I was hiding. She's the person who kept my secret when she could have exposed me. She's the person who risked everything to help bring down the people who forced me into hiding. She's the person who made it possible for me to come home. She's not our housekeeper, she's family. And I need you all to understand that." Elizabeth looked at as if seeing her for the first time. The older woman crossed the room and pulled into an embrace, something she had never done in 15 years of employment. "Thank you," Elizabeth whispered. "Thank you for bringing my son home. Thank you for being brave when we didn't even know we needed someone to be brave. Thank you for everything." Hugged her back, this woman who had employed her but never really known her, who had lived in a different world despite living in the same house. "You're welcome," said simply. Over the following months, the full scope of the corruption scandal unfolded. Governor Blake was indicted on multiple charges. Several other high-ranking officials were arrested or resigned. The network Thomas had witnessed 3 years ago was systematically dismantled by federal prosecutors using the evidence he had provided. Richard became something of a hero, the lawyer who had stood up to corruption even when it meant risking everything. His career recovered and then flourished. Firms across the country wanted to hire the man who had fought the good fight and won. Thomas entered therapy to deal with the trauma of his 3 years in hiding. It was a long and difficult process, working through the guilt and fear and isolation he had experienced. But he had his family's support, and slowly he began to rebuild his life. He decided not to return to finance, instead pursuing his passion for photography. His first exhibition, a series of photographs taken from the tower of the house, was titled The View from Exile and received critical acclaim. Graduated from college and became an advocate for protection, inspired by what her brother had done. She gave speeches about the importance of ordinary people standing up to corruption, about how change often comes from unexpected sources. Elizabeth underwent her own transformation. The experience of losing Thomas, nearly losing Richard, and then having both of them return to her changed her perspective on what mattered in life. She became involved in charitable work, but this time with genuine passion rather than social obligation. She also developed a real relationship with, one based on mutual respect rather than employer-employee dynamics. As first, she retired from housekeeping a year after Thomas came home. This set her up with a generous pension, far more than she had earned, in recognition of what she had done for their family. She bought a small house of her own, the first home she had ever owned, and spent her days gardening and reading and occasionally visiting the family, who now welcomed her as the honored guest she had always deserved to be. But sometimes, on quiet evenings, would drive past the house. It stood empty still, no buyer willing to take on such a massive renovation project. The tower room where Thomas had spent 3 years was dark now, the telescope gone, but could still picture him there, standing at the window, watching over the family he loved from a distance, keeping his lonely vigil. She thought about the night she had first climbed through that window, driven by dreams and instinct to investigate a mysterious light. She thought about how easy it would have been to walk away, to tell herself it was none of her business, to let Thomas continue his solitary exile. She thought about all the moments when she could have chosen safety over courage, silence over action. And she thought about what she had learned through it all. That heroism doesn't always look like what we expect, that ordinary people can do extraordinary things, and that sometimes the most powerful act of love is refusing to abandon someone, even when abandoning them would be easier and safer. Washington had spent most of her life being invisible, being overlooked, being underestimated. But when it mattered most, when a young man needed someone to see him and refused to look away, she had been there. She had been brave when bravery was required. She had been stubborn when stubbornness was necessary. She had been exactly what Thomas needed, exactly when he needed it. The Black Maid had trembled, yes. She had been terrified and uncertain and overwhelmed by forces far beyond her control. But she had trembled and acted anyway, and in acting, she had changed everything. As drove away from the house for the last time, leaving behind the old Victorian structure with its tower and its secrets, she felt at peace. She had lived a quiet life, a life that most people would consider unremarkable. But she had made a difference when it counted. She had helped bring a son home, helped expose corruption, helped heal a broken family. And really, what more could anyone ask of a life than that? To be there when needed, to act when action was required, to love fiercely even when love meant taking terrible risks. Had done all of these things. The Black Maid who had trembled had also triumphed, and that triumph, quiet and unheralded though it might be, was enough. The family would remember her. Thomas would tell his children about her someday, about the woman who refused to abandon him, would speak her name in speeches about courage and conviction. Elizabeth and Richard would honor her memory in their charitable work. But didn't need monuments or recognition. She had something better, the knowledge that she had lived a life that mattered, that her choices had meaning, that she had faced fear and chosen love anyway. She had been invisible for so long, but in the end, she had become the most important person in the story. As the house disappeared in her mirror, smiled. The Black Maid had trembled, yes, but she had also been brave, and brave had been enough to change the world, one frightened young man and one corrupt system at a time. The end of the story was really just a beginning, a family reunited, a wrong made right, a system forced to account for its failures, and a woman who had spent her life serving others finally recognized for the hero she had always been. It wasn't a perfect ending because real life rarely offers perfection, but it was good, and good, had learned, was often the best anyone could hope for. She drove home through the Connecticut evening, the setting sun painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, and she was content. The story of the Black Maid who trembled was over, but the story of Washington, hero, advocate, and family was still being written, and she couldn't wait to see what the next chapter would hold. "I'm sure," she said. "My mother sounded okay?" he asked, his voice hungry for details. "She's eating, she's taking care of herself, that has to be enough." Stood up and walked to where Thomas stood. She took his hands in hers, feeling how cold they were, how they shook with emotion or fear or both.